Hi, everyone. We're going to take a few more minutes just to let more people log on, so we'll be back in 2 minutes. Good afternoon to you all. Welcome to this year's PJM Summer Outlook. Presenting this outlook is myself, Diana Chiangwa, and I am the Regional Director of the PJM team. And also I have Sam Johnson, who is an analyst on the team, as well as Patrick Higgins, a meteorologist, as well as our demand forecaster, here to present with me. So first, just a few housekeeping notes. So first, we have on your left should be a tab where you can download the slides if you wanted to have a copy of these saved on your computer, and also you will see a tab to a survey that you will request you to fill it out at the end of the presentation. Okay, and as well, you also have a questions tab in which you can enter your questions at any point as well during the presentation, and we'll make sure to address them at the very end. Sorry, just dealing with a few technical difficulties right now, but we should be all set in a few seconds. So our agenda for this afternoon, we're going to recap the spring of 2015. So the past few months, we've had some interesting price days as well as not so much excitement, in March, April, as well as May. And then after that, we'll also look back at the past two summers, so 2013 and 2014, just look at some of the prices that we settled during those months, as well as the drivers. And then finally, we'll get into this summer looking at our demand forecast, and we'll touch on temperature and precipitation expectations. And then we'll also look at the generation changes that are expected in PJM, as well as some of the fuel pricings, the prices that we're expecting. And then finally, we'll take a focus on transmission, looking at the congestion patterns that we're expecting for this summer, and then also some new price definitions in the network, which will be impacting AEP and IMO this summer. So first off, I'm going to turn this over to Sam, who is going to go through some of the recap from the spring as well as the past two summers.
So before we get into the summer, we just wanted to talk a little bit about what we've seen this past spring. From a demand perspective, March verified in line with expectations. It was a lot cooler than we normally see during March, which was in line with our forecasts. April verified pretty close to forecasts. We were calling for normal conditions throughout most of PJM, which we did see, but we were expecting to see a little more cool conditions in Western PJM, which in the end we did not really see as much as we were expecting. In terms of pricing and how this demand and what we ended up seeing this past spring, the big takeaway is that prices were much cheaper year over year. Pretty much across the board, West Hub, AD Hub, day ahead, real time, you name it, prices were down compared to 2014. And you can see that in these graphs as well as the charts below, which show the averages from 2014 and 2015. The main driver behind this was cheaper fuel pricing, and gas prices in particular were down a lot year over year. This is something we will get into a little more later in the presentation when we're talking about the generation outlook for this upcoming summer. But something to keep in mind moving forward is those cheaper gas prices. So moving on to what we saw over the course of the last couple summers. So in 2014, from a demand perspective, was a pretty anomalous summer. June was much hotter. June was hotter than we normally see in June. But the really strange part was we actually saw a demand peak in June, whereas we will normally see summer demand peak in July. And last summer, July and August were much colder than seasonal averages. And one thing to point out about last summer, while we did see some very hot days in July and August, they're pretty short-lived versus sort of sustained heat wave. So it really didn't allow for demand to build day over day, which is generally what we need to see during the summer to get those really high demand days. Normally we'll get demand days in the between 150 and 160 gigs, whereas the peak last summer was only 142. So how did this translate into pricing last summer? June 2014 pricing was a lot higher than June 2013, about $8 higher year over year. But then July and August ended up averaging much lower. West Hub prices in the day ahead and in the real time just weren't nearly as strong. I mean, you can see in July in particular, we had a week of very strong pricing in the middle of the summer, and that really lifted the entire average. Basic story is June was warmer than normal, and we saw more expensive pricing, but then the rest of the summer was really very weak compared to what we generally see during the summer. And now I'm going to pass it off to Pat, who's going to talk about what we can expect this upcoming summer.
All right, thanks, Sam. So just jumping into what we have for the summer as a whole. So we have a couple main drivers there. The main one we're looking at, well, obviously we have an El Nino popping up in the Pacific, so that's the warmer waters in the Central Pacific. And the thing that's really going to swing the forecast one way or the other is we're banking on the PDO, which is warm waters in the Northern Pacific. We're expecting that to weaken as the summer progresses. So there aren't too many analog years, actually, that have that. But the ones that do have that tend to have warmer temperatures in the Midwest. So we'll start to see that eke into PJM as the summer goes on. Just looking month by month, June hasn't really seen anything so far. It's pretty weak the first half of the month. But actually looking at least the two previous Junes, we've only topped 120 gigs once, and then we've still seen 140 gig days in the second half of the month. So I'm still expecting us to see a nice 140, 141 gigawatt day in June, especially with things getting warmer as the month goes on. Heading into July, that's definitely our big month. We're expecting much above normal temperatures, especially just covering the Midwest. PJM West is definitely going to be the hardest hit there. And even going into South and Mid-A, it's still above normal. We're still expecting to see definitely more sustained heat than we saw last year. So our peak for the summer this year is going to be 156.5 gigawatts. That's what we have projected. In August, we start to see those warm temperatures pull back more towards the south, but it's still affecting PJM West, it's still affecting PJM South, so we're still expecting it to be warmer than last year. Heading into precipitation, we're expecting a pretty dry start to the summer. We've seen that already. So basically, June, we're expecting it to be pretty dry everywhere in the footprint. Heading into July, we just start to see that storm track build into the region. It's mostly affecting PJM West. And then once we get into August, then we start to see it go into ComEd and still affecting West. Basically, through the entire summer, we're expecting Mid-A and South to be dry, so that's actually a good bullish factor for demand. Heading into wind, which is actually pretty well correlated with precipitation. So I have here what we're expecting for PJM wind and also what we're expecting for MISO wind. So, yeah, so as we start to see that storm track build in further to PJM West, we're expecting, even though wind is usually not too strong during the summer, we're expecting it to be a little stronger than average. And combined with the fact that we've added more capacity than last year, we're definitely expecting more wind gen than in 2014. As far as MISO wind goes, it's actually going to be drier than normal there. So we did see some more capacity built into the footprint there. So we are still expecting overall wind gen to go up, but it's not going to go up as much as we're seeing in PJM. So moving on to taking a look at the 5CP forecast. So as Sam was talking about earlier, 2014 was really a weird year in terms of peak demand. We only topped out at 142, and that came in June. We haven't seen that at least since 2010. But looking at 2012 and 2013, those are 2 years that are pretty close to what we're expecting for 2015. As you can see, demand tends to peak in mid to late July, so we're expecting that to happen again this year, especially with the warm July we're seeing. So somewhere in between 154, 158, we kind of split that and went to 156.5. And sometimes you get a case where all of your 5CP days come in 1 week. 2013 was a bit of an extreme case of that, where we got 150 plus days. And then I think the more common situation is we see a couple of days kind of interspersed across the summer. So more like what we saw in 2012. I think in terms of what we're expecting it to be closer to 2012, where we see a couple 5 CP days scattered throughout the summer. But July is definitely going to be our big month for that. So actually we have a slide that Diana's going to cover, which covers demand response. So we'll start to see that in July as well. So Diana?
So to analyze and also come up with some expectations for this year's demand response, we looked into the past summers starting from 2010, but then I would like us to focus only from 2011 when we have APSI migrating to PJM so that, at least the demand numbers that we have are more comparable. So what you're looking at here are the RTO peaks on the days that we did see some demand response, as well as horizontally we have the different zones in PJM showing also the demand levels on the days that demand response was cold. So at least on the RTO level, the one theme that we did notice is that the moment that we see 150 plus gigawatts of demand, we are certain to see demand response being called out at the RTO level. And then in addition to that, we do see that in September of 2013, there were some demand response days that were cold, and you can see that the demand levels during that time is just above 144. So what we do see, the takeaway point from that is that in September we have a lot of generation already on outage, and the one thing you can expect is that we would have demand response being called out at demand levels that are less than 150 because so much generation is on outage. And the reason we want to highlight this is because when we compare the supply stack, which we're going to get into shortly, the supply stack from 2013 was a much bigger pie than what we have in the next few months. Therefore, you can expect that some days we may have demand response being called on days where the RTO peak is actually less than 150. So moving right into the generation analysis. So first off, this is a very big year for PJM in terms of generation retirements. We have here listed all the units that are set to retire by the 1st of June. And so far, we have actually noticed that a few of these units are already offline since mid-May. There are some units that haven't really been online. This is what we've verified using Genscape Power RT data. So units like Big Sandy, So units like Big Sandy and units like Muskingum River, they've all not been online over the past few weeks, and we can verify that some of those units are off. And then you also have some units such as Shoreville, which are also expected to be offline, that are still running. So just looking at the data since Monday, Shoreville has been running at about 40%, and this is definitely not expected. So in the first slide that we have here, we have this generation total broken up by the amount of generation on retirement in a zone. So AEP particularly is the zone that is going to see a lot of the retirements. We have about 5 gigs of generation expected to retire by the end of this June. And then taking this analysis further, we also looked at how important these units actually are in the supply stack. So the units that are set to retire, are they just lying dormant for the past few years, or are they units that are actually important to the supply stack? And we did this by looking at the at the capacity factor for all these units. So we have Big Sandy. We have Big Sandy, which is an 800 megawatt unit, and we looked at its output over last summer. And on the on the y-axis, what you see is just the production of megawatt hours over the summer. So you have a value for June, July, and August of 2014. So you can see that in June of 2014, the capacity factor for Big Sandy was as high as 80%, and then some other units such as Shoreville, capacity factor was about 53%. So this really does show that these units were actually a big part of the supply stack, and also just in terms of how much of the capacity was used during a year. So the units that are being retired were actually important, and even for those that only have a capacity factor of 13% or 20%, such as Camer and Tennis Creek, we did verify that they were actually in service and running on the days in which demand was over 140 gigawatts. So when you reach a certain demand threshold, all these units do start to play a bigger role in the supply stack. And then another change that we do have to our supply stack is the generation that has been built over the past few years. So we have, we're showing you the amount of generation since last year. This includes units such as Warren County, Nelson Energy, West Deptford, and then also graphed here are the additions that we're expecting this summer. So in July, on the 15th, we're expecting a unit. It's the Newark Energy Center. It's 876 megawatts, and this is expected to come online and should help to mitigate and offset the impact of some of the retirements that we have. So all in all, when you look at these new additions, we have about, in total, when you add all the additions since last summer, about 4 gigawatts of new generation. And then clearly you can see that the what we added into the stack is not anywhere close to what we actually lost. So we lost about 8.5 gigawatts, and this leaves us with a much smaller supply stack than what we had last year. So here we've plotted the fuel mix for PJM, looking at data from June 2014 and comparing that to what we're expecting in June 2015. And definitely you can see that we have a smaller pie. It was 179 gigawatts last summer, and then this summer we're only looking at 171. And then also just looking at the actual mix, you can see that coal naturally has become a much smaller piece of the pie at 36% this year compared to 39.6% last year. And then natural gas, having more of those units that have been built, they've all been natural gas units as well as wind. That's what we've added since last year. So you can see that there's an addition in the amount of natural gas units that we have. So we have natural gas at 17.7% this year, an increase of about 1.7 since last year. And then also just looking at our fuels, since last year, we're showing you here the fuel prices in dollars per MMBTU for gas, coal, as well as oil. And generally, this is something that was spoken about all year. Gas prices are much cheaper than they have been in a very long time. Looking at this year, particularly just this first week of June, we've seen TEDCO M3 pricing as low as $1.30 per MMBTU. So considering that trend and what we've seen all year, we may expect that the next few months we'll also see similar gas pricing. And this is also true with oil prices, which have been about half of what they were last year. So again, going forward, we are expecting for oil prices to be in the same range between $12 to $14. To bring all this information into a more digestible analysis, we ran our model. So this was the CM model that we use here at Genscape, and we went back and reran some models from previous years. So since Pat already said that he's expecting the demand to peak at about 156 this year, we went and ran July 18th of 2013, which was a peak day in the summer of 2013, and reran that using the supply stack from this year. So the results that we're showing here we have the supply stack. So this is pretty much just the generation output coming from this year's supply stack compared to the generation output from July 18th, 2013. And there's some very big differences when you just look at it. These include the amount of coal, which you can easily see when you look at this. When you look at this at these graphs, that coal in the off-peak falls off quite dramatically, and then at the same time we have gas also increasing at the same time. So in the next slide, we're showing you the actual deviations between July 18th and the summer supply stack. So on the y-axis is just the change between those two supply stacks. Coal is in green, and in orange we have the gas. So and then in blue we have the oil. So definitely when you're looking at the off-peak for July 18th, you can see that using this year's supply stack, we're dropping coal by about 10,000 megawatts, and at the same time gas is gaining in over 6 to 7 gigawatts. And then also oil does start to play a more important role when you look at that afternoon. So during that afternoon peak, there is more utilization of oil. And at the bottom here, on the bottom right, we're showing you the West Hub settle, as well as the West Hub scenario price that we got from running this model. And in the red is what it actually settled, and in blue is what our model predicted would have been the price had we used 2015 supply stack. And the general takeaway from this is really that during the off-peak and the non-peak periods of that day, we see the blue curve is lower than the red curve. Only when we get into that afternoon peak period, so from hour ending 14 to about hour ending 20, do we see the blue curve come in above the red curve. So what that generally tells us is that the supply stack is cheaper when you look at the cheaper gas prices, but the fact that you're missing a big chunk of your base load during the peak periods, you start to see some really big prices, which are being set mostly by the oil. So overall, expecting the summer to be on the cheaper side when you consider that not all days are going to be 156 gigawatts, but for those days when we come to demand periods over 140 gigawatts, then you may expect to see some really strong pricing, and this is mostly a function of just having a thinner supply stack. Then I'm going to turn this over to Sam, who's going to go through some of the congestion expectations that we have.
Hey, so it sounds like there might be a delay with the slides when we switch them and they're actually getting to you. So if I stop talking at any point, I just want to give an opportunity for the slides to catch up, so I'm not talking just completely out of context. With that in mind, let's talk about congestion this summer. So at the very end of the slide deck, you'll find a couple of extra slides that includes some of the line outages that we're looking at this summer that we think have the potential to drive congestion. But that's more of an appendix. And during the summer, a lot of the congestion we see tends to be driven solely by demand. So we've pulled a number of the constraints that have been the most common over the last 2 summers. I don't want to go into every single one, but I do want to highlight a couple of them that tend to be especially impactful. One is interface congestion. Over the last couple of summers, we've seen very strong congestion on the major west to east interfaces, 500X, AP South, Bedblaw. While we do still expect to see the interfaces congest this summer on strong demand days where demand is up in mid-A and south, they shouldn't be as impactful as they have been in summers past. And a lot of that has to do with some of the new generation builds along the East Coast. So the major gas units that have been built, like Warren County in Northern Dominion and West Deptford in New Jersey, those units should take some of the pressure off of AP South and Bedblaw in the case of Warren County, and off of 500X in the case of West Deptford. And again, it's not going to completely get rid of interface congestion this summer, but we do expect it to be reduced. The other constraint I wanted to touch on is Bagley-Grayston and bullish Pepco West Hub congestion in general. Bagley-Grayston is going to be out of service for the rest of June, at least during the week. So we can expect more of what we've seen in this past week, or really past 2 weeks, where we have some days when generation and BGE and Pepco fails to run, and we get very bullish West Hub congestion on lines like Conestone to Northwest. That's a trend that we can expect to see for at least the rest of June, and then the line is at least scheduled to be back in service for July and August. And then a couple zones in particular that we wanted to highlight. The first is DPL, where there's basically a bottleneck effect, and we get a lot of bullish DPL East Hub congestion on days of high mid-A demand, and there's really nothing that PJM can do about DPL congestion because of a lack of generation in the zone itself. So, for instance, last summer we saw really persistent congestion on lines like Harrington to Wells and Ocean Pine to Worcester. Those are things that we can definitely expect to continue this upcoming summer. Another zone that's pretty similar is Dominion. We had congestion at Cloverdale and on Kerr Dam to Beach DP and the tie lines with CPLE. And these are all constraints that are very bullish to Dominion and will be very common this summer as well. The last zone we wanted to touch on is ComEd. Congestion in ComEd during the summer tends to be pretty bearish in the off-peak in particular. Basically what happens is during the off-peak, there's a lot of generation running in ComEd, and the demand to meet that generation just isn't there. So a lot of that power gets sent over to AEP, and it stresses the lines between the two zones. So we get constraints like LaPorte to Michigan City and Burnham to Munster. And while these occasionally continue a little bit into the on-peak, they are generally off-peak constraints. So that's it for transmission. Like I said, there are a handful of summer outages at the end of the slide deck if you want to take a look at those. But the last thing we wanted to talk about are a couple of new definitions that PJM is changing for this upcoming summer. Both of them are effective June 1st. The first one AP is being broken up into 4 separate subzones. They're divided up in a pretty sensible way. They're divided by state. So the first one is the nodes in Indiana and Michigan. The second is all of the AEP nodes in Ohio. The third is Kentucky, which is not a lot, but there's a little sliver of Kentucky that extends into AEP. And the last is Appalachian Power Company, which is Virginia, or at least the AEP nodes in Virginia. So what we did is we took the AEP data from last summer and we ran an analysis of how pricing in these zones would have shaken out if the new subzones had been in effect. And as you can see, at the aggregate level, there's really not a lot of separation between the zones in either the day ahead or in the real time. They're all priced pretty similarly, but there are some constraints that on a day-to-day basis will drive some pretty significant separation between them. The one I really want to highlight is the Amos transformer. So this constraint hit really hard for a couple of days last week, and while the new subzones weren't in effect at the time, if they had been, Appalachian Power Company and the Kentucky Power Company would have seen significant upside above the other new AP subzones. Some other constraints that will drive separation between the subzones, Ruth Turner is also bullish to Appalachian Power Company. A big one from last summer was Monticello to East Winnemac, which drives up the Indiana-Michigan subzone, but not the others. So those are definitely things to keep in mind for the upcoming few months. And then the second new definition we wanted to talk about is IMO. So also effective June 1st, we basically did the same thing that we did with AEP. We took the data from last year and where the IMO interface cleared in June, July, and August of 2014 and compared that to where it would have cleared had the new definition been in effect. So the new definition in the day ahead is a blend of MISO and NISO pricing. So in the day ahead, it is 60% MISO and 40% NISO. In general, using this new definition, IMO is going to be priced more cheaply than it was under the old definition. While we only are showing you the analysis of how this would have shaped up last summer, we looked into some of the other months, and this really holds true throughout the year. It's not a huge difference. It's about $3 or $4 over the course of the year, but it is pretty consistent. Now, this new definition, the blend, the 60-40 blend, only holds true in the day ahead. In the real time, they have a really interesting definition where IMO is going to be priced based on scheduled versus actual flows on the Ontario to Michigan PARs or phase shifters. And these PARs move power between Michigan and Ontario. And the way it's going to work in the real time is if actual flows are greater than scheduled flows and in the same direction, it's going to be priced off of MISO. If actual flows are less than and in the same direction of actual flows, it's going to be priced off of the blend. And if actual and scheduled flows are in opposite directions, it's going to be priced off of NISO. So it's hard to predict exactly what this is going to do to the price, but we can say that it's going to be a lot more volatile because we'll see days in the real time when it flips from the NISO price to the MISO price and then to a blend. So it'll be interesting to see how that ends up working out this upcoming summer. So that's everything content-wise. I'm just going to pass it back to Diana to wrap things up.
Okay, so just to summarize some of our biggest takeaways from this year, we have, the summary slide. Pretty much in terms of the weather, we're expecting all that to be a bullish indicator to pricing, especially when you compare it to last year. Our peak last year was only about 142, and we're moving all the way to 156 this year. So definitely expecting to see higher pricing than last year. And then in terms of precipitation, similar to what Pat told us earlier on, we do have a pretty bullish east. It's going to be dry for most of the summer, and only in July and August do we start to see some storm activity in west and ComEd. And then when looking at our generation retirements, definitely there is a bullish signal coming from losing about 8 gigawatts of mostly baseload generation. So on those very high peak demand days, at this point, over 140 gigs, we may expect to start to see some really strong pricing throughout those afternoon hours. And then looking at our new builds, most of these have been gas-fired combined cycles, so these are definitely a very signal to our supply stack, particularly when you look at the generation that we have right now in Dominion, so that's Warren County, as well as some of those units in New Jersey, such as West Deptford and the July 15th expected generation, which is the Newark Energy Center. And then, like we've already said, in terms of fuel prices, definitely a bearish signal year over year. We're talking about half of what oil pricing was last year. And then also in terms of gas, mostly sub $2 prices will be expected this summer. This is looking at TETCO M3. And then in terms of congestion, we'll have some bullish days. Most of this congestion is expected to be localized, so we'll continue to see more of the BGE, Dominion, as well as APS and PEPCO congestion that we've already been seeing to start off the summer. So that's all we have for our summer outlook this year. I do have a few questions that we received during the presentation that we wanted to go through. So the first one says, are there any units that are retiring that will contribute to volunteer subspend congestion? So any retiring units that will exacerbate or mitigate volunteer subspend congestion. So to that, I would say that volunteer subspend is mostly a winter constraint. What we have there is TVA flows flooding into PJM and wheeling through into MISO as well, mostly during the early morning hours when we have our morning peak. So it's historically been a winter constraint, and with the retirements coming in the summer, those would definitely exacerbate the need for energy going into PJM. So a lot of that AEP generation will leave a sink in AEP, which TVA flows will come in and try to alleviate some of that deficit. But like I've already said, this is mostly a winter constraint, so I think this is something we'll only see once we get into December, January 2016. Another question we have is West Deptford going to relieve the Bagley-Grayson constraint or any other interface issues?
So the location of West Deptford is not going to help with Bagley to Greyston. It's located in eastern New Jersey, so it's actually north of the Bagley to Greyston constraint. That constraint is it's exacerbated by flows moving north to south from the New Jersey, Philadelphia area into Baltimore. So if anything, it's actually going to put more pressure on Bagley to Greyston. Basically, the way it works is more power to the north of the constraint, the harder it hits, more power to the south of the constraint, the less pressure on the line. The West Deptford, the Warren County plant that they built in Northern Dominion is one that will take pressure off of Bagley to Grayston. For West Deptford, with regard to the interfaces, it should help to take pressure off of 500X and central interface, but for Bagley Grayston, we think it'll make it worse.
The next question we have is, any of the nodes that make up AD hub changing or AD remain unchanged?
AD hub is not being changed, and the AEP zone is going to still exist. It's just there are now subzones within AEP. But yeah, no change to AD hub.
Okay, and then the last question we have is, if demand response is cold, do you expect it to be a bullish pricing event since it has to set price at $2,000, or do you expect it to be a bearish event like previous summers? And to answer that, definitely in 2013, what we saw is that we would have very bullish pricing for a very limited amount of hours, and then just after that, prices could dip down as low as $48 all the way from $1,800. So this was definitely an anomaly. I think that going forward, what we'll see is more localized demand response. So what we saw back in 2013 with ATSI, where ATSI itself was the only zone that was pricing that high. So I think that in terms of demand response, we should see more bullish pricing this summer, because I think it will be more on a local or zonal level than on an RTO wide basis. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have received right now. I do apologize for all the technical difficulties that we did have, but you will have a copy of these slides available to you, and also the recording will follow shortly. Again, we have a survey. Please feel free to fill that in. And other than that, thank you very much for attending this webinar, and we'll be talking to you soon.